Good morning, everyone. I feel so privileged, to be here participating in Hong Kong History Day. My contributions, to today's discussion would be to think about, infrastructure, spatial history through Hong Kong cinema. To be more precise, I'm just looking at one type of infrastructure, which is housing, a public housing project, in Hong Kong. And then I'm also going to look at specific themes. In the previous panel, I think, the panelists are quite concerned about age, and then we talked about age all the time. And for me, this would be an excellent opportunity to ask, our audience whether, you have watched these films before. Well, I watched all of them, of course. I'm a film scholar. But for me, this is not an exhaustive list, when I think about how space and public housing spaces are represented in these three themes. You can find many more examples, and I would love, to hear, your examples as well. But for me, these are really very important representatives during these 3 decades, of Hong Kong film history. And so I would like to, if you haven't watched them before, please, go and watch them. And if you have watched them before, then I hope that you will rewatch them, to understand, how actually it is so much about the intertwining of different kind of discourses and histories and imagination of Hong Kong, as well. So Alan Fong's Father and Son, produced in 1981, the beginning of New Wave cinema. For Chance Made in Hong Kong, produced in 1997, a film that, has a very strong impact, on my career, and also in Hong Kong history at the turn, of a very critical moment. And I feel a bit sad, when I teach, my students these days. I say, have you watched Made in Hong Kong and the Hong Kong trilogy by Fred Chan? I said, really? And you're like, maybe you missed something, that is so beautiful and important. But there's never too late, to visit, these masters. And Hui, of course, also, part of the new wave filmmakers, produced this excellent film, The Way We Are, about Tin Shui Wai, a specific, district in Hong Kong. There's a sequel to it, for those, who are Hong Kong film fans. And Night and Fog, which is like a complete, different version, of this very peaceful, drama. Okay, now, so maybe, I will start, why I want to talk about infrastructure, among other things. Actually, it's inspired, by Cecilia, that she has this project, on infrastructure. And for me, Hong Kong is always famous for its limited space. But in the same time, there are so many, massive infrastructures going on in our city. When I grow up, of course, one of them is the Rose Garden project, the Mui Guai Yun Gaiwa, the 10, major infrastructural development in Hong Kong. Well, that was quite a big, important thing, for us, to think about who we are, and also, the way that we construct, our belongingness, to the success, of the city. And I think that kind of discourses on urbanizations continues, of course, even after, the handover. And it becomes, so crucial, to the way we think about arts, So I think, it would be a very good entry point for us to really revisit, spatial history among, other important topics, of Hong Kong. So I'm not a landscape, architect. So for me, infrastructures will be more about these. I'm taking insights, from these thinkers, and theorists that I cite here. Infrastructure that transport people and commodities from railroads to highways to pipelines and beyond, mediate the national imaginary by offering a kind of material substratum through which such imaginaries are generated and negotiated. Of course, the notions such as imaginaries, would be most crucial to our understanding of space, and the history of space. And I'm more intrigued, by the way, not the infrastructure as a physical container, but then, how people actually interact, with these infrastructures, and also in the same time recreate the meaning of infrastructures. Actually, Abdul Malik Simone actually have this very exciting notion about people as infrastructure, to focus on how people actually, recreate that meanings. I would like to, just cite here by Simone that he argues that it is important to imagine a broader playing field in which the human condition in the urban realm is punctuated by relentless collisions between human situatedness, human endeavor and the inheritance of resourced realities. And I think, I want to build on, this idea of the focus of human agency, to think of, people as infrastructure in the context of Hong Kong, and argue that the changing relationship between space and the inhabitants in the case of Hong Kong actually help expose the inner structure of our public housing estates, and the larger infrastructural mentality. So in that three selected themes, I think that public housing estates are actually contact zones and targets of social material, interventions. And the reaction to it, the appropriation of it, would actually address the infrastructural regime, which leads to help the audience to consider the ways in which how they actually function. So that is how I want to approach these themes, also through the notion of infrastructure. And then why public housing project? Of course, I think Professor Cameron Choi just mentioned about sort of like the life before the public housing estate project, and which is somehow also directly related to the second May fire in the 1960s. And this is very interesting. While Professor Cameron Choi talks about the complexity of this whole policy making, and also the way that NGOs collaborate with the locals to work on the resettlement program, you will actually be not surprised that how these incidents, this complexity, are being generalized and also mythicized in cinema. And I think for specific reasons that worth exploring. So public housing projects, of course, continue to play a very major role in our city in helping social upward mobility, in helping people to settle in, to feel like they have a home that they can stay in, to feel stability, and comfort. So that's why, public housing estate actually has been a very important character, in Hong Kong cinema. Sometimes, they are just background. But then, in the themes that I am going to talk, I think, they have a larger role to play, that it actually tries to expose, the kind of human relations that generated, by and facilitated, by the spaces itself, but also provoke, certain kind of reactions and resistance to the structural violence that was imagined, in that public housing projects. So, Father and Son, 1981 by Alan Fong. Many of film scholars would consider this as a very important debut for Fong himself, but also, for the New Wave cinema. According to our former colleague, Gina McCarthy, this debut is not just an autobiographical work about the filmmaker's youth in the changing city of Hong Kong. Well, actually, there are actually quite a lot of films produced during the 1980s are autobiographical. And other very good example would be Anne Hui's Song of Exile, and Hak Tou Cao Han, which is also about, her personal history, living home, studying in the UK, and then back reconcile, with her family. So it's interesting. The film itself is not very complicated. It's about, the son, who is always, again, this very conservative father. Not only that he insists, the son needs to study, have a degree overseas, but then also sacrifice, the daughter's educations, because of their gender. So it's a very typical but also realistic, Confucian dilemma, that you can witness, in the film. But then more important of that is, if you watch the film, carefully, there is also this depiction of the fire that forces, the family, to move, to a proper, housing estate. And the film, begins, with the father walking up, the stairs of this public housing estate. So what happened, actually, you will see, in a minute, is the father actually, suffered from a heart attack, when he climbed up, the steps, and then he fell and he died. And then so the son, from abroad, have to travel all the way back home. And the film then begins, to retell the story through flashbacks. So that is, what the story, how the story, begins. So what I find, particularly interesting is, of course, this use of the staircase to set up the death, of the father, which, of course, is purely, symbolic. So this act of walking up a flight of stairs does not merely just showcase the infrastructure itself. So it is about building the society the society vertically, at the beginning of the 1960s and 70s, and that is also this implication of upward mobility that this infrastructure is going to provide the inhabitants with. But then, situating, this scenario by climbing up but then fall and died, in the same time is actually, a very powerful way to think about how the staircase is depicted as a kind of extension of the society's expectation of upward mobility, but in the same time the failure to achieve that, because it is the death, that is being experienced, at the end. And I think, it is also interesting, to think about how we always, talks about, being able to acquire a unit is called 上樓. So I think that kind of upwardness, is always there, in our cultural, imaginaries. But then, this particular scenario actually asks more thoroughly about, so what does it mean, by being able to 上樓 and succeed, because it's the failure and the fall and the death, that is accompanied, with it. So for me, this is the way that, how Hong Kong cinema reimagines, the public housing space, at this very critical point, when everyone, is celebrating, the sort of the benevolence, of the colonial policy for allowing people, to be able to be part of the larger, society. But in the same time, that is this critical engagement with it. So I think, this is one example, for me to think about how this could be an interesting take. Now, quickly, Made in Hong Kong, and other, film that was produced, 10 years later. It totally different, scenarios, when the public housing estate is depicted many years later, when it is no longer, as a very amicable spaces, but then a public housing estate is being depicted as dangerous and also spaces of violence as well. So not going into details about the theme itself, about 4 youngsters. All 4 of them died at the end. A very sad story. Each of them, is has its own, issues and challenged in many ways. But most of them, grew up in either fatherless, family, or father's parents are not really doing their jobs. What interests me is rather than thinking about what is the interior spaces, of this public housing estates, much of the focus is on the corridor itself. Most of the events, danger and violence, is actually takes place, in the corridor. And it was often represented, in this kind of dark daylight. So for me, it is interesting to reflect. So how, these corridors leading to home and also leading to suppose imagination of stability, is being depicted in such a unfavorable way, and where all these different possibilities, of happiness, is being destroyed. So again, by looking not at the interior or the life, within the homes, as the major event, of this film, but the corridors itself that sort of like letting us, to think of the liminal spaces in Hong Kong cinema. Lastly, The Way We Are, an entirely different take, of public housing estates in 2008, situated, in Tin Shui Wai, which was formerly, being labeled, as City of Sadness because of its relatively high crime rate, or because it was a place where many immigrants stayed and also being segregated and separated, from the rest of the society. Now, what is interesting about Anne Hui's film? Now, Anne Hui is a favorite, in the comparative literature department. Because she is always very reflexive, on the themes, and also she always, play with possibilities. Now, while on the one hand, people may be expecting to have, problems, violence, unhappy, tragedy, in the film, there's nothing. Even, it's so uneventful, you will find it so boring. Nothing happened. It's just, the story about this mother, quiet, and the son on. And then you're expecting, this young boy, is going to be a pack of gangster, playing mahjong, but then you're doing wild things at the same time. But nothing, he has this little fantasy, about, his teacher, and nothing, problematic actually happened. But then how to understand that kind of everydayness that was being highlighted in the film? Almost on the one hand, so mundane, so unimportant, so repetitive, and so boring. But there are moments in which that we see, of course, these kind of loneliness, about this and other main character, the granny, who's alone, by herself. But I want you to pay attention, to the strategic use, of separations, within the frame. That is, you can always, go back to the film. You will find there's so many moments that there are 2 frames, within the one that And Hui tries to remind us that possibility of differences and duality that always play, in our everyday life. So for me, it's very interesting to see, how these different, spaces are being played out, in Hong Kong cinema, and also the dinner scene is very, very interesting as well. So I would just end here, is a bit, brief, but I think, I hope that, it will help brings your memories, and recollections, of the Hong Kong films that you have watched, and we can share a bit, about your, example, of public housing projects, films later. Thank you so much.
Yep.